RB able to find one. The approach from behind. Artis mows them down.
It's coming through from short. Ethan needs to go big, and he does. Ethan. Hello. Someone's going to turn around soon. Please don't mess this up. I'm just going to tell you right now. Do not. Oh! No!
Well, by Team Liquid, Cobb also gone for another.
It's just meant to be. MC was right, they're touched by God, they're meant to win, they're going to win the whole thing.
Champions is the final tournament of the Valorant season, where 16 of the greatest teams across the world face off to crown one final champion. Whoever wins LCQ this weekend will grab the final American spot for champions. But there are 3 other teams that already locked in their spots by qualifying for Tokyo. So let's take another journey down memory lane to visit the fascinating stories of these 3 teams. But first, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel. I have a ton of really cool Valorant videos that I want to make, and subscribing lets me know that you want to see them. I have an outline of my future video plans in the description if you're interested. The story of NRG starts with FNS, a long-time Tier 2 NA Counter-Strike player whose biggest headline was receiving death threats from an angry Brazilian player. In Valorant, he played for the team Together We Are Terrific before the team was signed by Envy. Envy was always known as Scrim Demons, but never could close out any tournaments, always falling just short. Even with the additions of Victor and Crashies, the team just couldn't make it over the line. So they brought in Marved and Ye, and those 2 changed everything. They immediately went on an insane run, qualifying for Berlin and making it all the way to the grand finals. Gambit bested them that day, but hopes were high going into Champions. Then Victor caught COVID, and Envy was eliminated by X10 in groups, despite beating them in the first round. It was a complete disaster for the team. If they wanted to win a title in Valorant, something would have to change. Luckily, something did. The name. Envy was never a very strong brand, so they decided to partner with Optic Gaming, who would take over all of their FPS teams. So Optic was now in Valorant, allowing them to bring their amazing documentary series, The Process, along with the team during their Masters Reykjavik run. I highly recommend watching it, as it is way more interesting than anything I could ever say. But the gist of it is this. Optic dominated North America throughout the split, but ended up losing to the Guard in the grand finals. This meant that the Guard got to skip the group stage in Reykjavik instead of Optic. Optic's first opponent was the same team that had eliminated them at Champions, now playing as Xerxia. Optic wanted their revenge, but they didn't get it. They lost once again. NA Hopium was at an all-time low. They managed to bounce back against Crew, and then won their rematch against Xerxia. Then they went on a miracle run of insanely close games, beating Guard and DRX to reach the upper finals. And it is here where we take a diversion, to meet our next team, Optic's fated rival. As mentioned previously, Brazil was not a very strong region in Valorant. The only Brazilian teams to ever win any matches internationally were Vikings and Vivo Keyed. With such a massive fan base craving a Valorant team to get behind, it was only natural that the largest organization in the country, Loud, would spearhead this effort. They started with Sasi and Sadhak, the 2 best players on Vikings. Then they grabbed some of the most promising upcoming players in Aspas, Les, and Pancada. This team was built to dominate, but no one really knew how much. In their first match, before they had even been officially signed, they 13-0'd their opponent on both maps, which is just straight up bullying. The team they beat played one more match as a team and have not appeared in professional Valorant since. That's the kind of domination we're talking about. They continued that dominance, crushing everyone they faced in Brazil. Like the Guard, Loud got to skip the group stages and go straight to the playoffs. They beat Team Liquid and G2 before meeting Optic in the upper finals. And this is the beginning of El Clasico. This rivalry is filled to the brim with insanely close matches, unending overtimes, and jaw-dropping clutches. But the map that started it all was nothing like that. It was a complete thrashing by Optic on Fracture. They seemed destined to lock in their spot in the grand finals. But Loud didn't go down that easy. They had a dominant defense on Ascent, then Les pulled out a monstrous performance to win Icebox and knock Optic down to the lower bracket. Things immediately got dicey for Optic in the lower finals. Zeta Division was in the midst of a Cinderella run, carrying the hopes of Japanese Valorant on their backs. Optic trailed 11-5 on Haven. But Marv decided to have the match of his life to help pull off the comeback. Optic closed out the last 2 maps to set up a rematch with Loud in the grand finals. And oh boy was this one a doozy. Every map was close, the second and third going to overtime. Both Aspas and Ye popped off for over 70 frags, and Marv was close behind with 64. But everyone had their moments throughout the series. In the end, Optic pulled off the win, evening the score with Loud, and more importantly, winning their first championship. The next split played out pretty much the same as last one, but with a few major differences. Optic dominated all the way up to the grand finals, where they lost to Exet to put them in groups at Masters once again. Loud didn't even drop a single map in their victory lap around Brazil, but somehow ended up needing to play in the group stage because NIP lost to Crew in the Brazil LATAM LCQ. Then, the most absurd situation happened. Optic, the Reykjavik winners, and Loud, the Reykjavik runner-ups, were placed in the same group at Copenhagen. Then, they both lost their opening matches, forcing an El Clasico 3.0 to avoid a last place finish at Copenhagen. Thanks to the second place curse, Optic once again took the series, with the final map going to overtime because of course it would. Optic made it out of groups to once again play their NA counterparts in the first round. Exet fell out of the tournament in the exact same way as the Guard at Reykjavik. Optic failed to defend their title, but still managed a third place finish. Next up was Champions, and guess what? Loud and Optic were once again in the same group. This time, they both won their first matches, so El Clasico 4.0 was not an elimination match. Ye had an absolute field day in this match, especially on Fracture. Loud would lose, but still qualify for playoffs. However, Optic now had a commanding 3-1 lead in this rivalry. Both teams would win their first 2 matches, setting up El Clasico 5.0 in the upper finals once again. This time, Loud would take the win in such dominant fashion that it left FNS dumbfounded. Optic barely managed to hold off DRX in lowers to set up El Clasico 6.0 in the grand finals. Optic hoped to repeat their success from Reykjavik, but Loud were better prepared this time. 2 overtime victories highlighted Loud's momentous win. The first non-North American or European team had finally won a Valorant championship. After a year of disappointment from Brazil, Loud had finally shown everyone that Brazil was a top region in Valorant. Unfortunately, this would be the end of this iteration of El Clasico. Optic with 3 wins, and Loud with 3 wins. With franchising comes massive changes, and there was certainly a big one. Despite this team being around since the dawn of Valorant at First Strike, despite their incredible reign of dominance that will certainly not be recreated for a very, very long time, and despite the storied history behind their organization, Optic were not chosen for the franchise league. The team now survives through NRG, with FNS, Crashies, Victor, and Ched being joined by Som and Artis. Marv originally wanted to take the year off by riding the bench on Sentinels, but he ended up playing anyway. Ye got fucked over the hardest. After getting dropped by Cloud9, he joined Disguised Toast's team in Challengers, but the team played so poorly that they failed to win a single game with Ye. It was such a poor performance that Ye decided to donate his last paycheck to charity. I don't think people realize how much of a fall from grace this was. Ye dominated damn near every tournament he played in. Just going by VLR rating, he was number 1 in Berlin, number 6 at Champs 2021, number 2 at Reykjavik, number 4 in Copenhagen, and number 1 again in their final Champs run in 2022. But why did this all happen? Well, Optic finished second at Champions. The second place curse had to close out the pre-franchising era with a bang. Loud did get into franchising, but they weren't unscathed. Sasi and Pankata left the team to join Sentinels. Rumor is that Saucy was a bit too hard on Loud's younger players, so they didn't fight too hard to keep him. They were replaced by 2E's and Cowanzine. These teams now had very different rosters, but when they met at lock-in, El Clasico was the same as ever. I know this rivalry is known for insanely close maps, but it's also had its fair share of complete stomps from both teams. Optic won a 13-2 at Reykjavik, then they won a 13-3 at Champions. Loud responded with their own 13-3 in the upper finals that left FNS completely stumped before claiming the Champions Trophy with a 13-5. Loud had flipped the script and were determined to keep it that way. They pulled off another 13-3 win at lock-in, putting doubt on whether or not El Clasico would survive the changes. What followed were two of the most intense maps of Valorant ever played, with NRG taking an overtime win on Pearl and Loud taking the overtime win on Fracture. Loud would continue on to the Grand Finals, where they were 2 rounds away from taking the trophy on home soil. Unfortunately, Fnatic had other plans. But things were still looking up for both teams. Sam and Artis weren't hitting the same highs as Ye and Marved, but were still playing well. 2E's and Cowanzine, however, were making a strong argument that they were just as valuable as their predecessors. During the regular season, Loud had some shaky moments, but didn't drop any of their matches. NRG were not so lucky. They tried to experiment with their roles a bit too much, costing them 3 series that they really should have won. Luckily, they cleaned it up in the second half, putting them in perfect form for the next El Clasico. NRG shocked the undefeated Loud with 2 dominant map wins. In playoffs, Loud returned to their invincible form, while NRG fell to EG. They rebounded in the lower bracket to reach the Grand Finals for the 9th and most recent El Clasico. The series had no overtime, but a 13-11 scoreline is basically the same thing. Loud took the win and a free slot to playoffs in Tokyo. But remember what happened last tournament? How Loud nearly won the Grand Finals, but Fnatic had that crazy comeback? Loud finished lock-in 2nd place. EG humiliated Loud in the first round of playoffs, then Edward dealt the killing blow. The reason for Loud's collapse are for men like Sideshow to mull about. I'll instead focus on one question.
Do you believe in the power of a curse?
NRG had a much more impressive showing in Tokyo. They rolled through their group before meeting Fnatic. Other than a disastrous misplay by Artis on Sage, NRG didn't really do much wrong in this series. They just played against the greatest team in the world. They rebounded in the lower bracket, asserting NA's dominance along the way. Then they fell to Paper X to finish in 4th, with Sam losing one of the most painful clutches of all time. But for the first time since Masters Berlin in 2021, there were 2 North American teams in the top 4 at Masters. And now, it's time to meet that other team. This part of the script has changed more times than I can remember, because this team is just absolutely absurd. In 2021, Evil Geniuses spent much of their time in Valorant losing. They were the first to pioneer a mixed roster, with Potter and Claudia joining Alexander, Temperature, and Osius. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This roster was not very good. They couldn't even make it into the top 16 of an open qualifier. Even when they remade the roster with Roka, Branchit, and Foe, they were still uninspiring. And since they couldn't qualify for VCT events, they had to play in third-party tournaments, where they weren't as bad, but still not particularly impressive. There are a lot of teams like this, teams that just don't have the firepower or resources to stay competitive in the scene. But those teams are usually free agent teams, or playing for smaller organizations. EG is not like that. They've been around far longer than most. They have storied histories and numerous esports titles. They also have plenty of funding thanks to being bought by an investment firm in 2019. They even have a spot in the LCS, the most successful esports league in North America. For them, having a team perform this poorly is just embarrassing. And people couldn't help but blame Potter for all of this. Yes, she is a woman, which unfortunately garners tons of unjustified criticism from all the closeted misogynists in esports. But she was also 34 years old, and not a very strong player, so some criticism was justifiable. So, after a year of no results, Potter gave up her spot as a player and took up the head coaching role. To replace her, they brought in Boostio. They grinded out some more third-party tournaments to finish out 2021 before bringing in Reformed, your boy Trey, and Jogamo to start 2022. The team was finally ready to compete. Just kidding, they got eliminated in the round of 32. But then, they came out of nowhere in the second open qualifier to make it into the VCT circuit, beating some strong teams like Ghost and Rise on the way. The team was finally living up to its name. Oh wait, they just lost every game in the split. Well, at least you made it. Now let's switch Dre and Foe out for Calm and Apoth, and get eliminated in open qualifiers once again. They rebounded in the second open qualifier, and finally started getting things together during the split. They pulled off some strong wins against Sentinels and Luminosity. Then they shocked the world by beating Optic, the reigning champions. It seemed like this team was finally having their breakthrough. Unfortunately, they only won one playoff game, and were immediately eliminated at LCQ later in the year. But their small semblance of success and strong relationship with Riot helped them earn a spot in the franchise league. Now they could attract some of the top tier talents and finally become competitive as a team, right? Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. They waited for all the other good free agents to get signed before picking up Ethan and BCJ. Don't get me wrong, these are two great players, but not the kind of signings that everyone was hoping for. So they decided to sign even more players, bringing in Demon One and Screwface for their reserve roster. They now have two separate rosters running at the same time, which was controversial to say the least. Then, in the third week of the split, they decided to bench BCJ, their most prolific signing, to bring in Demon One. Everyone hated this move, and Potter was criticized heavier than ever before. But Potter knew something that we didn't. With El Diablo out of the league, the King of Hell needed a new vessel from which to dominate Valorant from, and he found his next host in Demon One. They started a little slow, falling to Furia and Loud, but then they hit a hot streak, beating Leviathan, Sentinels, and MIBR. Unfortunately, they fell short against NRG in the final week, leaving their hopes of making playoffs in dire straits. Their only chance to make it in was for MIBR to beat 100 Thieves.
Shoot the fucking gun!
Well, would you look at that? They barely squeaked into playoffs thanks to MIBR, but they still have to face NRG again, just a week after losing to them. But this time, it was a completely different story. They got an overtime win on Split, then dominated Haven. They rolled through Cloud9 like it was nothing, and that was it. Evil Geniuses had made it to Tokyo. Well, at least some of them did. Demon One was unable to travel to Tokyo, as he didn't have a visa yet, so the EG dream will have to wait until Champions. Oh wait, just kidding. EG's manager, Kurt G, pulled some strings and got Demon One to Tokyo. Now EG had their full squad at Masters. They ripped through the lower bracket with relative ease, with their only close map being an absolute scorcher from Boostio. Then they faced Loud in playoffs. The last two times these teams faced off, things went pretty rough for EG. They had good maps at the start, but fell apart in the third, with one being the first ever 13-0 in VCT. This was a tough start for EG, but the narrative of the second place curse was stronger. EG moved on to face Team Liquid, the winners of the EMEA League, but they were no more than a road bump on EG's miracle run. They were now in the upper finals without dropping a single map along the way. But up next was Fnatic's God Squad. Pretty much every player on Fnatic is arguably the best in the world in their role. EG had momentum, but not nearly enough to get past Fnatic. Next up was PaperX, who played without something.
Without what thing?
No, something, the Russian player who was playing in Japan until he got signed by PaperX and helped them win the Pacific League, but he couldn't get a new visa in time for the event.
Wow, I guess he's not just some nobody.
Well, of course not. Nobody plays for EDG. They had a good run too, but PaperX stopped them in their tracks. Despite playing with their substitute, CGRS, PaperX managed to battle past EDG and NRG to face EG in the lower finals.
I'm so confused right now.
It's okay. All you need to know is that PaperX put up a good fight, but EG closed out the series to get a rematch against Fnatic. And it honestly went better than last time. Yes, they did lose 3-0, but Fnatic got to ban EG's two best maps, Pearl and Fracture, while picking their own best two maps, Lotus and Bind. EG made Lotus a bit more competitive than last time, but narrowly lost Split. Now they had to win Bind, the map that they were permabanning up to this point. They didn't really have much hope here, so they went with an absurd agent composition with Chamber, Raze, and Reyna. It's like the 2021 and 2022 agent metas had a baby. There was no reason this comp should work, but it nearly did. EG were up 12-7 before Fnatic realized that the agent comp was absurd and closed out the match in overtime. EG had made it all the way to the grand finals, farther than any other insane underdog run had ever made it, but Fnatic were just too powerful. EG were still incredibly impressive though. Their run at Champions should be on everyone's radar, but there is one concern left for them. EG finished in 2nd place. The curse is now upon them.
You believe in the power of a curse.
Next up was PaperX, who had played without something.
I thought you were gonna, my bad. I thought you were gonna start from like towards the top. I was like, alright, I got a little while.
No. Yeah, I was skipping to like the first sentence. Alright, ready?
Yeah.
Next up was PaperX. Oh, fuck. I forgot to read through.
Alright, we got
Alright,
this.
third time's a charm.
Yeah.